So, Michael, why should we care about gerrymandering? I mean, how does it distort the democratic process?
Thank you for having me here. And I guess where I will start is sort of one of my favorite quotes from John Adams, who wrote in 1776 when the founding generation just was starting to think about what our democracy should look like. He wrote in his what was later published as Thoughts on Government that legislatures and that legislative bodies should be an exact portrait, a miniature of the people as a whole. And that is, after all, why we have elections every 2 years, much more regularly than other countries do. You know, in other countries, they have elections every 4 years or every 5 years. We have elections every 2 years because the founding generation really thought that as the mood of the people changes, so should the composition of legislative bodies. And so they expected a lot of turnover in the US House and in state legislatures. But what gerrymandering does is it puts a thumb on the scale, so those elections, the results of those elections are really largely predetermined, and that elections really almost don't matter. And I have to stress that there is sort of a racial aspect to this, in that gerrymandering, especially in the South, but not only in the South, is heavily comes at the expense of communities of color. Because we're a residentially segregated society, it is easy to move the dial up or down in terms of partisanship by packing together, breaking apart communities of color. That's much easier to do than with white communities, which oftentimes are much more mixed. In terms of partisanship, Democrats live next door to white Democrats live next door to white Republicans. Sometimes they live in the same house, and so it can be kind of hard to gerrymander using white voters. But communities of color will be targeted for gerrymandering purposes, and not only in the South. If you look at like Long Island in New York, you see like Latino and Black communities on Long Island and in New York were split apart to enable a Republican gerrymander.
I know that at the Brennan Center, you've spent a great deal of time researching these issues, thinking about these issues. So, in terms of possible solutions, what do you think is the best way to go? Are there states that you think provide a particularly good model?
So the one thing I always say to people when they talk about redistricting reform is that it is not one size fits all, and that we should not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. That like if you could take what is an F student, and many states are really frankly F students right now, and bring them up to being like a C minus or a C plus student, you should do that, right? That even incremental steps, you're moving in the right direction. And so there are many different ways that you can tackle this problem. The biggest way is simply to break up the single party monopoly, right? We know from lots of evidence that when one party controls the process, that they will go to town and they will put their party's interest above all else, and that sort of drives the process. And simply breaking it up by requiring a supermajority to pass maps, or requiring a certain level of support from the minority party of the legislature, goes a long way into assuring fair maps, because either the parties will compromise or they will deadlock, in which case a court will draw the maps. All that said, one thing that works really well, having said that one size doesn't fit all,
Right.
one thing that has that is growing in popularity is the use of independent commissions. And then you see that in Arizona, California, joined this decade by Colorado and Michigan. And independent commissions, there's a bunch of features that are designed to sort of take the politics out of this and make sure that community voices are there. The commissioners are selected through, they have to apply. There's vetting of the commissioners by a neutral body. The lawmakers don't pick directly, who serves on the commission. They may have some say in the process, but they don't ultimately pick who's on the commission, so they can't game it in the way that you normally would. But then more importantly, there are strong rules about how commissions operate and rules on how they pass maps. So take California, for example. The California Commission has 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents. And in order to pass a map, you have to have a majority of the Democrats, a majority of the Republicans, and a majority of the independents, right? So it's not as though Republicans and independents can get together to screw Democrats or any other combination. You actually do have to have multi-partisan support, pan-partisan support. And that goes a long way. It's a system of checks and balances. Lawmakers may not, or the commissioners may not be perfect people, but there are checks and balances in the process, and that just goes back to some really basic government principles: is not letting one party control the whole of the process.
Well, that's a good point, and maybe just for the benefit of our audience, in most of the states, Michael, it's actually the state legislature that actually draws the maps, right?
That's right. Most states, it's still the state legislature, subject to, in most states, gubernatorial veto. But while in the past we used to have more divided government, that's a relatively rare phenomena these days. Most states are under the control of one party or the other.
And also, is it fair to say that given the opportunity, both parties take advantage of this?
Well, from history, that's absolutely true. Like Democrats in 1991 drew a really aggressive gerrymander in Texas, so that they continued to control the majority of the Texas congressional delegation, even though the state was trending toward, at the time, becoming a fairly reliable Republican state. And so, well into the early 2000s, the majority of the Texas congressional delegation were Democrats, in a red state. But in more recent decades, it has been Republicans who have an advantage.